No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 8. El Dragon begins his tour of the Main. John Hawkins and Francis Drake arrived back in Plymouth within days of each other in January 1569, having fought their way separately through the Caribbean easterlies and then across 6,000 miles of stormy Atlantic. No record exists of what was said at their reunion, nor of whether Hawkins ever reproached his brash young cousin for sailing away from the debacle at San Juan de Ulua without orders, and without ascertaining whether the older man had survived. In any case, the two men worked together now and again throughout the rest of their lives, and both dedicated themselves to wreaking terrible vengeance on the Spaniards for having cheated and bludgeoned them out of the profits of trade. In Drake, the fury flamed so fiercely, and his desire for Spanish treasure was so great, that he made no fewer than 6 return voyages to the Spanish Main over the next 3 decades. Of these, 4 forays were epical. Not so much for the gold they returned, indeed only 2 were very successful in that respect, but rather for their fantastic adventures, and for their triumphs of human spirit over every adversity. Repeatedly, Drake's expeditions were beset by false starts and calamitous setbacks. The captain was forever engaged in some trial of wits against the Spaniards, against the elements, and, on occasion, even his own men. Again and again, by the most minute accident of timing, captured cities would yield no treasure. Cornered quarries would elude his grasp. Even bagged treasures would slip through his fingers. Yet again and again, Drake rebounded from disappointment. He was never at a loss for ideas to amend his plans, to cheer his weary men onward, to leave the Spaniards quaking in fear of where he might spring his next attack. It was for these traits, perhaps more than his actual swag, that Francis Drake earned the adulation of his countrymen and the awe of the Spaniards, who came to call him El Dragon, the sea serpent. At one point, Philip II of Spain offered a reward of some 20,000 ducats for Drake's life. Many a 16th century city was ransomed for less. This man, who rose to be one of the most monumental figures of his age, came from humble origins. According to accounts of contemporaries, Francis Drake was born around 1540, the eldest of 12 sons of Edmund Drake, who was a tenant farmer living in the village of Tavistock near Plymouth. Edmund was apparently an outspoken champion of Puritanism, and at a time when the Reformation was scarcely 2 decades old, and passion blazed between Catholics and Protestants. In 1549, a Catholic uprising in Tavistock impelled the Drakes to flee to the safely Protestant stronghold of Kent, where the impecunious Edmund lodged his brood in an abandoned hulk hard by the king's dockyards on the Medway River. There, while the father preached the fire and brimstone of the new religion to his Majesty's sailors, the child Francis played among the spars and rigging, and began imbibing the lore of the sea. Both the religious fires and the promise of ships were to leave an indelible mark on him, and to drive him throughout his life's work. Young Francis Drake was not long in putting his learning to practical use. He shipped to sea at 14, as apprentice to the master of a tiny coastal vessel that piloted French and Dutch merchant ships into the Channel and frequently smuggled refugees from the Spanish Inquisition into England. From the outset, he seemed to have made a strong and favorable impression on his captain and his fellow sailors. When the master died, Drake, who was not yet 20, inherited the ship. Before long, he sold it, and with those proceeds traveled down to Devon to find service in his cousins, the Hawkinses, the family whose scion John, some 10 years Drake's senior, would be peddling smuggled slaves on the Spanish Main. After sending Drake as a junior officer on a few of the family's slave-trading ventures to the Guinea coast, John Hawkins evidently deemed the young man ready for command, and in October 1567 put him in charge of the Judith on the voyage that led to the San Juan episode. If the disaster at San Juan de Ulua taught Drake nothing else, it taught him the necessity for thorough planning. And now, as he prepared to attack his enemies, he made 2 voyages of reconnaissance to the Spanish Main. Of the first, in 1570, just a year after his return to England, scarcely anything is known save that it spanned about 6 months and was financed by Hawkins. The second venture took place in 1571, and a few details exist. Drake's ship was the Swan, a little vessel of scarcely 25 tons and only a few guns. But Drake had chosen her for that very reason, inconspicuous and harmless. She could go virtually anywhere she pleased, triggering no alarms among those who chanced to see her. Drake left Plymouth in March, and within weeks he was easing through the Caribbean, intent on scouting the coastal contours of the Spanish Main, and the ways and means by which the Spaniards drew their wealth from that area. Somewhere on the Gulf of Darien, which laps the east coast of the Isthmus of Panama, Drake put in at a secluded bay hidden by a jungle that descended into the water's edge. There was good fishing in the bay, as well as freshwater springs and an abundance of fruit and game ashore. Drake even named the site Port Pheasant for the flocks of wild fowl to be found in the forest. From that comfortable hideaway, Drake scouted the 500-mile scalloped coastline between Cartagena, the capital of the Spanish Main, and Nombre de Dios, the isthmus port from which the annual treasure fleet embarked for Spain. What he did not learn from his own stealthy prowling in the Swan, he acquired by the shrewd tactic of befriending the Cimarroons, runaway African slaves who shared his hatred of the Spaniards and willingly gave him help. Drake returned from his reconnaissance trip around the new year and immediately began planning the expedition that in some respects was the greatest of his life. For it summoned forth his full talents for organization, forethought, unflagging stamina, stunning surprise, and brilliant recovery from misfortune. A detailed account of the voyage, edited in 1592 by Drake's nephew and namesake, son of his youngest brother Thomas, was published in 1626 under the title Sir Francis Drake Revived. The great seafarer himself contributed to the narrative, and in a preface to it, his nephew states that Drake made the voyage to right the wrongs he had endured at the hands of the Spanish at San Juan de Ulua. This time he did not slip away from England quietly, as he had in the past. The Hawkins family and other wealthy Plymouth merchants were on hand to wish him Godspeed as he left Plymouth on May 24, 1572, with 73 men in 2 ships, the Pasha, a 70-ton vessel that he commanded himself, and the little Swan, now captained by his brother John. Another brother, Joseph, went along as a member of the company. They were provisioned for a full year and armed to the teeth with cutlasses, pikes, pistols, muskets, even bows and arrows. Their most precious cargo, according to the nephew's narrative, consisted of 3 dainty pinnaces made in Plymouth, taken asunder all in pieces and stowed aboard, to be set up as occasion served. These handy prefabricated craft were the versatile boats of 20 tons that could slip in and out of waters too shallow for the ocean-going Swan and Pasha. They carried sails but could be rowed if the wind failed. With a brisk northeast wind off his quarter, Drake laid straight for his mark. 12 days out he sighted the Canary Islands, where transatlantic vessels usually put in for water and provisions. But Drake's little fleet, related the account, never struck sail nor came to anchor, nor made any stay for any cause, neither there nor elsewhere, until 25 days after, when it reached the New World. Arriving at Port Pheasant, where Drake had left supplies the year before, the expedition found that someone had been there in the interim and had dug up all the stores. Undaunted, Drake settled in and set his men to assembling the pinnaces. When the vessels were ready, he moved camp from Port Pheasant to an island about 75 miles from Nombre de Dios. He named it the Isle of Pines for its dense forestation. There he hid the Pasha and Swan in a sheltered cove, leaving a small detachment to mine them, set out near the end of July with most of his men in the pinnaces for Nombre de Dios. The great adventure was about to begin, and in mounting excitement the English raiders rode in rhythm to the songs of their native Devon. 5 days later, on a dark night, with only the stars for light, the tiny fleet crept stealthily toward the bay beneath the town, and anchored out of sight behind a promontory. Drake intended to wait until the dawn and pounce on the town just before it awakened for the day. But the men were tense with anticipation, and at 3 a.m., As a late rising moon brought a glow to the eastern sky, Drake declared it to be dawn. They came ashore on a beach outside Nombre de Dios. A lone Spanish sentry guarding a nearby shore battery spotted them and fled to arouse the town. Drake paused long enough to topple the battery's guns, then rushed on as the clanging church bell sounded the alarm and drew the suddenly wakened population into the marketplace. But Drake had a plan too sly for the sleepy citizens to counter. At the edge of Nombre de Dios, he split his force into two groups, sending half of the men under his brother John around the outside of the town to enter the marketplace from the far side, while he and the remaining raiders marched up from the harbor with a flourish of trumpets and drums and a shower of flaming arrows. The Spaniards pulled themselves together long enough to retort with what Drake's nephew's account called a jolly hot volley of shot. A musket ball killed one of the trumpeters, and another struck Drake in the leg. For the rest of his life, he was to carry that musket ball in his flesh. But for the present, he bore his wound in silence, cheering on his unsuspecting men. Meanwhile, a new burst of trumpets and drums and a fiery rain of arrows announced the arrival of Drake's brother John and the other detachment from the far side of the town. The Spaniards were now confused and terrified. They fled by the hundreds, down the side of the streets and out into the countryside, while the English made their way to the governor's house, flung open the cellar door, and there, by light of torches, beheld an incredible cache of silver bars stacked like cordwood in a pile 70 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 12 feet high. But Drake was after a greater booty still, and he stayed his men from falling upon the silver, telling him that the king's treasure house down by the waterfront was likely to have more gold and jewels than their pinnaces could carry away. He was about to order them to it when suddenly his wound overcame him. With a groan, he stumbled forward and fell. Only then, noticing his bloody trousers and footprints, did the men realize that their commander had been shot. Drake ordered his brother and the men to proceed to the treasure house, but John would hear nothing of it. Nor, to their credit, would the men. There would always be treasure, provided there was Drake. Instead, they bound their captain's wound with a scarf, gave him a nip of spirits, and carried him back to the pinnaces, abandoning the treasure altogether. For several days the raiders camped on an island beyond gunshot of the harbor while Drake nursed his wound. They found plenty of fowl and fruit to eat, and they looted fine wine from a Spanish ship in the harbor. Presently an envoy appeared from the town, bearing a white flag of truce. Drake, with an extravagant show of hospitality that would become his hallmark, plied his visitor with food and drink, then demanded gold and silver as his price for leaving the town in peace. The envoy departed to confer with his fellow townsmen, at which point Drake reconsidered his precarious situation. His wound still troubled him and placed a burden on his force. The envoy would undoubtedly report this, as well as the meager size of Drake's band. If the more numerous and better armed Spaniards chose not to pay, Drake could scarcely mount another attack now that all surprise was gone. Even worse, the Spaniards might invade the island and doom his entire enterprise. Drake decided on a tactical retreat. He and his men vanished from Nombre de Dios and reclaimed the ships they had secluded at the Isle of Pines. But Drake was never the man to linger over ill fortune. As soon as his leg had healed sufficiently, he took his little force across the Gulf of Darien to see what mischief he could stir up at Cartagena. Drake could not dream of assaulting so well-defended a city, of course, but finding a ship from Seville lying at anchor in the adjoining bay, he seized her at night while her crew slept below decks. Then, in the morning, flaunted his triumph by hoisting English colors and sailing her past Cartagena harbor, out of gunshot but in full view of the Cartagenians. Cartagena rang its church bells in alarm and fired its cannon in helpless rage. Drake sailed his prize back to the Isle of Pines, after first depositing the Spanish crew unharmed on another island. In taking on this additional ship, which, at 240 tons, dwarfed his other vessels, Drake was faced with a new problem. He did not have the sufficient hands to man her in addition to the Swan, the Pasha, and the 3 pinnaces. Clearly, something would have to go. He could not spare the pinnaces. They were indispensable for the surprise raids and swift getaways that were central to his plans. The Pasha was essential as his flagship. Reluctantly, he decided to sacrifice the Swan, the ship for which both he and his men had the warmest affection. Sensing that his men would balk, Drake resorted to a leader's license and engaged in an artful piece of deception. He summoned the ship's carpenter, Thomas Moon, and directed him to go down into the Swan secretly and bore 3 holes alongside the keel. Then to lay something on top of the holes, enough to obscure them from view, but not enough to prevent slow leakage. Moon unhappily did as his captain bade him. The next morning, Drake set out to go fishing, taking his brother John with him. As they rowed past the Swan, Drake arched his eyebrows in mock surprise. Was not the Swan riding rather low in the water? John hurried to investigate and discovered that the hold was full of water, obviously from sprung planking somewhere. All day the men sweated and cursed over the pumps, while Francis Drake himself lent a hand from time to time. But it was no use. By late afternoon the men were exhausted, and in a mood to agree when Drake suggested that the Swan was doomed. Sadly the men stripped the gallant little vessel of everything of value. They put her to the torch, and no one save Moon and Drake was any wiser as to the real reason for the Swan's demise. Next, in Drake's ever-fertile imagination, was a plan for a daring assault on a mule train that fetched the magnificent Peruvian treasures across the Isthmus of Panama to Nombre de Dios. But as Drake knew from the friendly Cimarroons, the mule train would not be moving till January, when the rainy season ended. It was now only September 1572, and for the next 4 months Drake left his men by turns at a hideaway along the Gulf of Darien to clear a site in the jungle for a new base, while he took others off on miscellaneous shipping raids. The raids themselves reaped nothing more interesting than cargoes of hens, hogs, maize, and honey, but they did provide food, and they kept everyone honed to a keen fighting edge. But in late November, the misfortune that was beginning to cling to him like a leech made itself felt yet again. Returning from a brief foray, Drake discovered that during his absence some of the men had spotted a small Spanish sloop passing offshore, and they could not resist having a go at it. His brother John, who had been left in command, had tried to dissuade them, sensibly pointing out that they had neither the men nor the weapons for such an undertaking. But lacking his brother's firmness of command, John had succumbed to the men's urgings. And so, armed incredibly with nothing but a broken rapier, an old harpoon, and 1 rusty musket, John and a few of the boys raced their pinnace out to assail the sloop. In the boarding attempt, John Drake was immediately shot. His stunned companions broke off the attack and took him back to his ship, where he soon died. Francis Drake returned to that sad news and shortly faced worse. An epidemic of yellow fever. In a scant few days, 30 of the crew perished, among them his older brother Joseph, and the ship's doctor, who escaped the disease only to die while sampling a potion he concocted in the hope of curing his patients. By the time the plague subsided, Drake's original force of 73 was now reduced to 41. Then, however, came the news that he had been waiting for all these months. The Cimarroons reported that the Spanish fleet had arrived at Nombre de Dios to await the treasure coming overland from the city of Panama. Instantly, Drake sprang back into action. Replacing his lost men with Cimarroon recruits, and leaving the ships and pinnaces in the care of those recuperating from the disease, Drake set out overland in the first week of February to make his strike against the mule train that would soon be coming across the spine of the isthmus. With him were 30 Cimarroons and 18 Englishmen. Once the band left the fetid coast and climbed into the highlands, they found the way through the rainforest very cool and pleasant by reason of those goodly and high trees that grow so very thick. They climbed cheerfully upward along the same path the mules would travel, marching in the early morning, resting in the midday heat, resuming the march in the late afternoon, then halting again for the night. During their halts, a guard stood watch at the edge of the encampment to listen for the tinkling bells that would announce the approach of the mule train. The rest of the company engaged in some impromptu acculturation. The Cimarroons taught the English how to make palmetto huts for shelter, and Drake taught the Cimarroons to say the Lord's Prayer. After 6 days, they reached the summit of the ridge that bisects the isthmus. Here the Cimarroon chief led Drake to a great tree that had footholds cut into its trunk and a wide platform high in its branches. Reaching the platform, Drake beheld a sight that was to dazzle his inward eye for the rest of his life. Some 25 miles to the south, the broad Pacific rolled off to one horizon. In the opposite direction, the Atlantic reached to the limit of vision. Overcome with that combination of patriotism and religious fervor that so constantly drove him, Drake fell to his knees, looking at the Pacific, beseeched the Almighty for leave to sail once in an English ship in that sea. He would do so one day, but he had a more immediate job at hand. 2 more days of marching brought the band down the forested mountainside into an open plain, and another 2 days brought them within the vicinity of Panama. When they were close enough to count the ships in the harbor from a hilltop, Drake halted his men and sent a Cimarron dressed like a Spanish slave into town. The man returned with the welcome news that a treasure train of mules would soon be setting out from Panama that very night for Nombre de Dios. Accompanying the train was to be no less a personage than the treasurer of Lima, traveling with his daughter. 8 of the mules were to be laden with gold, 1 with jewels, and 5 with silver. Drake swiftly turned his men about face and marched them 12 miles back into the jungle. His order for the night assigned the men to positions strung out in the underbrush on either side of the trail. Any southbound travelers were allowed to pass unmolested toward Panama. Utmost quiet must be observed until Drake would blow his whistle. On that signal they were to leap out of hiding and fall upon the mule train. Drake called for supper and a dram of brandy all around. Then the men took up their stations, and a hush fell over them. Darkness came, and for a long hour in the stillness nothing could be heard but the trill of tree frogs and the calls of night birds. At last Drake's men heard the faint tinkle of mule bells. Then suddenly came the sound of hoofbeats, but they were those of a single horse, and they came from Nombre de Dios, the wrong direction. Drake's men crouched low in silence, all except one Englishman, Robert Pike, who lost his wits and leapt up out of his hiding place without waiting for Drake's whistle. A Cimarron instantly pulled him down by his shirt tails. The traveler continued on his way, spurring his horse to a canter. After what seemed an interminable wait, the sound of the mule bells grew louder and louder. At last the mule train entered the stretch where the ambush was set, and Drake patiently waited for it to align itself between the 2 strings of men. Then he whistled. Out they jumped to fall upon their quarry, and were greeted with yet another shattering disappointment. The mule baskets proved to be holding nothing but food, and neither the treasurer of Lima nor his daughter nor an ounce of gold was anywhere to be found. A mule driver explained to the crestfallen Englishmen what had happened. The horseman, alas, had caught sight of the impatient Pike, and when he encountered the treasure train a few miles down the trail, he had alerted its leaders that something was amiss. The treasurer of Lima had immediately turned back to Panama with his daughter and the wealth, sending only the victuals on. The Englishmen could scarcely believe their foul luck. But in adversity, Drake always showed quicksilver resilience, and tonight was no exception. Rapidly regrouping the men, giving them no time to mope, he hurried his raiders back along the path toward Nombre de Dios. Along the route, they paused at Venta de Cruces, an inland settlement that served the Spaniards as a way station. Drake and his men had bypassed the village on their way across the isthmus. Now they raged straight through it, pillaging as they went, and then resumed their race to the shore and the pinnaces. Once again, Drake had failed to gain any plunder worth recording, but his raid befuddled and upset the Spaniards. In a single night, this infuriating Englishman had sprung out of nowhere, captured a mule train, pillaged a town, and then vanished as inexplicably as he had appeared. He was as mystifying and elusive as he was terrifying. To minds just emerging from medievalism, with its rich literature of fabulous creatures, Drake's sudden strikes and equally sudden disappearances conjured up visions of the mythical dragon, hence the origin of the epithet El Dragón.